The next element to get into in our story of the scientific revolution, the scientific method, and its impact upon society is this time period that historians typically note as the Enlightenment. It's an important time in the history of philosophy, an important time in the history of social science, an important time in the history of religion. And so let's get into it. The Enlightenment. The main question I would suggest that's offered by the Enlightenment is, can we apply science to society? Can we come up with social science, if you will? The Industrial Revolution had showed in really tremendous fashion that there are practical applications to science. We found this in mechanics and dynamics in particular. So thinking about, if nothing else, transportation and the locomotive, the idea of we once had to get from point A to point B on foot or on horseback, maybe covering 20 miles, maybe even 30 miles a day. And in the locomotive, the rocket, we could cover it first 16 miles in 1 hour and then 50 miles in an hour. Amazing. So can we not come to some way of using science to help us to solve some of society's problems? Can we apply the scientific method to analyze the human condition? Now, those of you majoring in psychology, sociology, counseling, etc., are thinking, yes, finally we get to my discipline. And this is where it begins. Can we use the methods of science to try to understand the way humans organize themselves and how perhaps we can enhance the lifestyle, the lives of humans? Just as scientists have identified and articulated laws of motion in nature, are there laws governing human nature? This concept of the Enlightenment is perhaps also well defined by the philosophers of the day. Immanuel Kant, one of the great philosophers of the day, who argued we should dare to know. We should dare to know that which is around us. Have the courage to use your own intelligence, he says. So not just that we should wait for philosophers and scientists to tell us things, but we ourselves should investigate. We should dare to know. We should use our brains. This is also an age of skepticism, being skeptical of traditional authority. We've already seen this with the Renaissance. We've seen this in science. And so now we are going to see it applied to society as well. Be skeptical of traditional lines of political authority, social authority, perhaps even religious authority. Bayle attacked, this fellow Pierre Bayle, he attacked superstition, religious intolerance. And superstition isn't necessarily just religion, and religion is not necessarily superstition, but other elements in life that we might ordinarily take for granted, right? Whatever that might be. If you think of any of the superstitions that you may follow in your own life, whether it's crossing your fingers for luck or not walking on cracks in the sidewalk, whatever it may be, Pierre Bayle is going to say, don't let these superstitions drive things in your life. But he's also going to be wary of religious intolerance, that there's more than one way to get to God. He argued that the Christian religion in particular and morality were not necessarily related, that there may be other ways of being a moral person. Very famously, he's quoted as saying, a man can be moral without being religious. There is nothing more extraordinary about an atheist living a virtuous life than there is about a Christian leading a wicked life. Now, there's lots of ways to take apart that statement for sure, right? And we are at a Catholic institution, and it's incumbent upon me to say, well, not all Christians are wicked, of course, and all Christians can be better Christians for sure. But his suggestion is that when it comes to crafting laws, when it comes to coming up with an idea of justice, it doesn't necessarily have to be rooted in Christianity. Now, we can agree or disagree, and that's fine. My point is that this is the first time that we're starting to see people articulate and argue these ideas. And it comes out of this age known as the Enlightenment. The other issues that's going on right now is that science in particular is becoming radically, radically popular. Before, you had to sort of seek out the company of scientists. You had to seek out like-minded friends who were sharing books or sharing articles. Now it's becoming far more popular. Mary Shelley is an example of this. Her book, Frankenstein, was the most popular book ever written. It went into so many different publications, so many different printings. They've made plays out of it within a couple of years of the book coming out. There are, in the 20th century, of course, an extraordinary number of versions of Frankenstein the film. I think there's actually a new one that just came out a year ago. So we're popularizing science. The ideas of Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton are becoming popular in literature. There's a fellow by the name of de Fontenelle who wrote a book called The Plurality of Worlds. And so we were getting very popular approaches to understanding this new science that suggests that the Earth is not stationary. The Earth is not the center of the world or the center of our universe, but something else is happening. So all of these things that so excited scientists during the scientific revolution are starting to challenge and excite the imaginations of the popular reading public. The other things that are happening that during this period known as the Enlightenment are that there's more world travel happening. We talked about how we had the age of exploration. Ship travel is becoming more accessible. We're starting to apply steam to traveling on great ships, not just sailing. Merchants are writing travel logs. More tradesmen are writing about these various places and worlds that they've gone to. One of the really popular ones in Britain in particular was a work called On the Ceremonies of the Chinese. And in this book, again, very popular reading, people come to understand that there are other cultures, other civilizations that are very highly developed, that are doing amazing things. And you already know about the Chinese and their technological advances. These are starting to come into European popular culture. And that even though they're very different, they have very interesting customs. This adds to, and not just this book, but many others, that there's this idea of cultural relativism. The idea that our culture doesn't do the things that the Chinese do, but that doesn't mean that the Chinese are better than us, and that doesn't mean that we're necessarily better than the Chinese, right? It doesn't mean that our way of doing things is the only way of doing things. So for the first time, that concept of cultural relativism starts to come into popular thinking, popular ideas. This combines with religious skepticism. And so it is, when you think about Immanuel Kant saying, dare to know, it is a sort of an opening, if you will, of the world, of European ideas to the globe, to worldly ideas. Imagine if you can, and I don't know if it's even possible, that you went to school without ever using Google, and then suddenly you're starting to use Google for the very first time. And you're just coming to understand what that database can do and how miraculously you can come into different ideas, different attitudes, and then you can compare and contrast. Now, the 19th century is not nearly as fast as Google, but what we're seeing is the development of more and more newspapers, more and more books, more and more literacy. More and more people are starting to get an idea of the globe around them, and it's starting to get them to challenge that which they originally knew, and they're getting very excited about what's out there. More concepts in popular culture. The 19th century is the development of museums, museums for the public. A lot of museums previous to the 19th century were private museums, and now there's state museums, public museums where the world is coming to you with these extraordinary objects from history, these extraordinary textiles from China, these amazing weaponry coming from South America. All of these things are coming into your world, and you're learning more about the world. We already mentioned how books are very important. Hobbyists, there are going to be people who are collectors, who want to collect stamps from around the world, coins from around the world. And as they do that, they're going to start to learn the history. And we're going to see more and more of that as a popular pastime, particularly in the rising middle class in Europe. We have a fellow by the name of G.H. Lewes, or Lewis, who says who was a philosopher and a contemporary of the 19th century. Science, he says, is penetrating everywhere and slowly changing man's conception of the world and man's destiny. Right? So not only what is the world like, but what is my place going to be in that world? We're very scientific today in our thinking. We're very much aware of the benefits and potentially the challenges of science. And for the first time, 19th century, this is becoming the norm. That leads us to some of our other ideas about science and society, right? So if science is becoming very popular, and not only is science becoming popular, but we're learning more about different groups of people and different places in the world, and we're getting there faster and faster than before, and we're coming back. That's kind of world travel is getting less dangerous than it once was. What about applying science right here at home, in my community, in the society I live with? We get people like Montesquieu. Montesquieu is out of France. He again is right here in this period in the 18th century. We're talking about the 18th and 19th centuries, and he is going to attempt to apply the scientific method to social and political realm to ascertain, as we've said before, natural laws that govern social relationships. He's interested in governing and how best to govern people. The work that he's most famous for is called The Spirit of the Laws. So Montesquieu argues that there are forms of political institutions. The way that we get the political institutions that we have depends upon some particulars. If you remember our discussion of the scientific method, he's going to argue using inductive reasoning, right, that we start with the smaller particulars and we argue towards the more general. So he says a particular kind of political institution will depend on climate of a region. He says it might depend on the kind of soil that produces the natural resources of a region, particularly the kind of how can we feed our people. You know this from the discussion by McClellan and Dorn about the use of water and irrigation. He's going to say it depends on the geographic size of the state. A small state will be governed differently than a large state. And it's also going to depend on the customs and the traditions of the people who live there. Again, a very scientific, if you will, approach to determining the kinds of political institutions that exist and why they exist as they do, and then perhaps what's the best political institution for your country. So he comes up with what we might call some general theories of political science. He says that a republic, much like we have in the United States, works best in small geographic locations, so small countries, based on that they have a tradition or a custom of great citizen involvement. All right, okay. Switzerland for him is the best example at that time. Monarchy is good in a middle-sized state, he says, and middle-sized probably both geographically and population-wise. But it also is a place. Monarchy works well in a tradition where the ruling class favors or follows the rule of law, so that the aristocratic elements, the wealthier elements, see it to their advantage to actually follow law. They want a monarch in charge because they're too busy living the lives they live and dealing with their own complications. They don't necessarily want to govern every day. They'll be happy to have a monarch so long as the monarch also follows the laws. And then despotism. He says despotism is typically good for very large states where you have lots of people, lots of geographic region, and you've got to maintain some kind of order. And so a very strong leader is perhaps the best for you. But despotism also works in a society where the leader can rely on fear to rule. It is interesting that he connects both despotism, so a strong leader, strong-arm leader, with relying upon the fear of the people. So Montesquieu, trying to come up with a scientific way to understand how political forms work and which forms work where. And he's basing it on geography, soil, climate, the cultures and traditions of the people who live in a particular region. All right, so we can decide whether or not that's a good scientific process. Other things that we're going to see during this time period, encyclopedia. We're going to see for the first time an encyclopedia. And I throw this in after Montesquieu because Montesquieu is able to sort of think about all of these ideas, but he's got to have a big base of knowledge. And for the first time, we get an encyclopedia here in the 18th century, and this is a classified dictionary of the sciences, arts, and the trades. This is Diderot, a Frenchman also, and Diderot decides to put together this great compendium. He first wants to do so because he wants to provide a lot of information about the world to teachers in a relatively cheap fashion. And so again, a compendium of all knowledge, all the knowledge that he could collect. This is the first time anybody's done this, right? You'll find specialized books, Aristotle wrote a book on botany. So you'll find a book on botany, but you won't find that Aristotle wrote a book of all knowledge, right? So Diderot is trying to do this, and this is a ridiculously ambitious charge. So a compendium of all knowledge, he is going to offer, again, popularizing science. He's going to offer a nice explanation for the layperson on Copernicus. He's going to offer a nice explanation on Kepler and other great leaders in the scientific revolution. So you'll get that entrance. So under C, you'll find Copernicus. Under K, you'll find Kepler. And then under W, you'll find how to build a brick wall. Now think about that for a minute, right? So what we have here is this rather esoteric mathematical knowledge that we're going to try to explain. And alongside that, we're going to also have some very practical knowledge, some practical technical knowledge, how to build a wall, how to dig a well. He'll talk to you about the best way to dig a well, how to do that as well. So what he's trying to do is put together all of the sciences, the arts, the trades, technology, and put it into a great collection. What he does when he puts this all together in a book is he's going to elevate the practical arts alongside science. And this is going to make the person who needs to build a brick wall, and this is our first how-to book, he'll put it alongside how to understand the movements of the planets, right? So again, a very interesting development in the popularization of science, but also in this idea that the human arts, the practical, the scientific, they're all connected in a logical scientific aspect. So not only is political science an actual science, but the work of the people, the basic work of the people, is just as important as the work of great mathematicians. It's just potentially as scientific. Corrections, it says. That's not a correction for the video, but it's a correction from Cesare Beccaria. Cesare Beccaria, some of you know, well, we're moving into the 18th century. Cesare Beccaria, very famous for working on how on earth do we correct that human behavior that we find unacceptable in society. Right? So his book on crimes and punishments is one of the first modern books on corrections. How do we correct human behavior? Is there a science to that? Right? Can we change that? Typically in his day, the death penalty was very common for what we might consider rather minimal crimes. Theft, any theft that rated a felony charge. And some of you know the differences between felonies and misdemeanors. Some of you may know it too well, but at any rate. For example, in England, stealing a horse is a felony. That could get you the death penalty. So Beccaria says, this is not working. We still have crime. We still have people committing felonies. So how can we best do that? He does suggest that corporal punishment is dreaded by people. Right, that this idea of physical punishment is dreaded, so maybe we should engage in lashings, if you will. But he suggests that taking away the freedom of an individual is perhaps the greatest punishment and the best corrective. Again, we're in a time, you can see his date, 1764 is when he writes his book on crimes and punishment. We are talking about the human condition. We are talking about what makes a state. This is a time of the American Revolution. This is a time eventually of the French Revolution. And this idea of freedom, liberty, is a very big issue. Another element of the Enlightenment. And he believes, Beccaria, that taking away the freedom of an individual is the worst thing you could do to them. And again, he's thinking psychologically, he's thinking politically, and certainly physically. So for the first time, trying to decide, using the scientific method, how can we correct the behavior of individuals? Another famous name associated with the 1700s, Adam Smith. And we don't have time to go into all of Adam Smith's ideas about economics. And many of you know Adam Smith well. But he writes a book called Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, often abbreviated The Wealth of Nations. And for Adam Smith, he says there are laws to economic behavior. And you probably know these laws. We famously talk about the laws of supply and demand, that if supply of something is very high, the demand will go down. If the supply of something is very low, the demand will go up. You only need to think about every time Apple launches a new iPhone, right? At first, the supply is rather low and controlled because everybody wants to be one of the first people to have one, right? So we really jack up demand. Now, you could get an iPhone 6 pretty easily, pretty quickly because they're out. The demand is a little less, the supply is larger, right? So Adam Smith helps us to understand that there is a certain aspect of human behavior that governs the economy. And there's certain aspects to the supply of goods, the supply of even information that drives economic behavior. We want to get a little more into social science because we've been talking about Montesquieu, we've been talking about Beccaria, we've been talking about Adam Smith, and many could lump all of these endeavors into the collective social science. And it would be remiss of me, having taught with Professor Heck on occasion, not to mention Auguste Comte. And Auguste Comte is the father of what we call positivism. And from the Oxford Dictionary, what I get is positivism is a philosophical system recognizing only that which can be scientifically verified, right? That which can be scientifically verified, or which is capable of logical or mathematical proof. You've seen this before, right? How do we find an axiom? You've seen this before in our video on the scientific method. So, a philosophical system recognizing only that which can be scientifically verified, or that which is capable of logical or mathematical proof, and therefore rejecting metaphysics and theism. More on those. Positivism, part 2, the theory that laws are to be understood as social rules, valid because they are enacted by authority or derive logically from existing decisions, and that ideal or moral considerations should not limit the scope or operation of the law. Let's say that one again. The theory that laws are to be understood as social rules, valid because they are enacted by authority, or because they derive logically from existing decisions, and that ideal or moral considerations, i.e., that, or for example, that a rule is unjust, should not limit the scope or operation of the law. You can see skepticism here. You can see cultural relativity here, right? You can see a rejection of a universal moral authority, such as the church here as well. So some of these ideas of the Enlightenment you can start to see here in positivism. For Comte, human history had passed through 3 stages. First off, the theological. Religion brings us to knowledge. God is the Alpha and the Omega of truth, of knowledge, of fact, right? So he said that was us in our early days. Metaphysical, that in metaphysics, the philosophy brings us to knowledge. The philosophers do this, whether it's Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas or others, that philosophical inquiry, the exercise of philosophical inquiry, brings us to knowledge, brings us to fact. And for the positive stage, experimental science is the source of knowledge. Boom. It's the scientific method. Proof. Mathematical proof. Logical proof based on mathematics. So Comte represents in his philosophy that he believes that human knowledge, human approach to the world around them has gone through these three stages, and that in his time, experimental science is the source of knowledge. This is going to bring us to, in this time of the Enlightenment, we've been sort of hinting at it at the edges, that we're going to start to see when it comes to philosophy, when it comes to understanding the nature of things, the nature of human relationships, that we might start to see some butting heads, if you will, between religion and science. There are going to be a series of debates between great thinkers, in particular Pope Pius IX in 1864, and again, this is a little later than our Enlightenment era, is going to suggest that when it comes to thinking, when it comes to the philosophical process, it's an error to believe that the methods of the theological doctors in the medieval university are unsuitable for the demands of society and even the demands of society today, right? That we can use the philosophers, the metaphysics, the Thomas Aquinas, the Aristotle. We can use these approaches to logic, these approaches to knowledge. The scientific method isn't the only way, the church will suggest. There are other ways to achieve knowledge, and it is wrong to believe that the church leaders, the philosophers at the medieval university, are wrong. It's the philosophers at the medieval university who set the scene to have the scientific revolution, he would say, and he's not wrong. We also have philosophers like T.H. Huxley who will debate that traditional faith is incompatible with what we now know of the natural world. Traditional faith is incompatible with what we now know of the natural world. You can see it starting to come together, right? You can see the debate starting to form. Science, he says, has led to a big change in the way we think. And his most colorful quote is that extinguished theologians lie about the crib of every infant science as the strangled snakes about that of Hercules. Basically, there's mythology behind the Greek hero Hercules, that when he was a child, and he is heroic, right? He is the child of Zeus and a mortal woman. So he has a destiny that's important, that there were powers that wanted to perhaps challenge this Hercules even as a baby and sent snakes to his crib to get him. And Huxley is saying that theologians lie about the crib of every infant science as the strangled snakes about that of Hercules. So very colorful. I have this photo for you. This is the baby Hercules dealing with one of those snakes. What's fascinating to me is this is a beautiful work of Hellenistic art. It is housed today in the Vatican. So the Vatican has this wonderful statue that Huxley is referring to. I found that a bit ironic. So we've been talking about the Enlightenment, and we've been talking about these connections to trying to apply science to society. We've talked about it in terms of popularizing science, in terms of trying to craft a social science. Can we find laws? If we can find laws that apply to nature and the way that nature works, can we also find laws that apply to human nature and the way human nature works? But before we leave this time period, I want to do a little bit of a transition because at the same time we're having some of these arguments between the papacy and Huxley and others, we're starting to see even more interesting and exciting developments, particularly in chemistry in Germany. We've been talking mostly about these developments in England with regard to science and technology. And in the 19th century, we start to get more and more developments in both chemistry and biology that are very exciting and are coming together with the Enlightenment. Justus Liebig, for example, in Germany, he was an apothecary. And again, thinking about this transition to science, he's an apothecary. He's someone who is what we might call a pharmacist today, but certainly didn't have to go through any training or have a license to be a pharmacist as you would have to do today. He's an apothecary. He will sell you potions. He will sell you herbs. He will try to find medicines for your upset tummy. That's what he does. He will also be at the University of Gießen in Germany, and he will make that transition from apothecary to chemist. While there, he will craft a research laboratory. So for the first time, we're starting to get research laboratories in the university run in a systematic manner based on the scientific method. He'll have students who will come and work, and they're all going to work independently, much like you are in this class. You're working independently, but then they will come and they will share their work with one another, and they're required to report back regularly. So the first sort of what we might consider graduate seminars, the first sort of science classes in chemistry, where we're working in the lab, we're working independently, but we have to share our work with one another. We have to let people know our successes and our failures and how we're progressing. Some of the first examples of this start to happen in Germany in the 19th century. This method, the scientific method applied to the university, we'll find that German scientists are going to become known for their chemistry. Just ask Schubert. That's a good German name, isn't it? Just ask Schubert. He will tell you. Germans' chemistry really rock. They also become famous for working in physics, right? Physical science. There will be a second industrial revolution. It will come in Germany, and it will be chemical, right? You might say, oh, well, what do you mean? We're going to start to see how do we craft dyes, right, from natural substances. So we've been crafting dyes for textiles, say, from natural substances. There are plants out there. There are animals out there. Squid produce an ink. Certain plants produce a nice dye. German chemists are going to try to figure out how to synthesize those and make them into larger quantities. For the first time, we'll start to use things like willow bark to be synthesized and used in a mass fashion. That's when Bayer, B-A-Y-E-R, or Bayer in Germany, will first develop what we know as aspirin, right? Taking willow bark and turning it into a synthesized product that's easier and right on your shelf. You don't have to go out and scrape a willow tree whenever you've got a toothache. You can just pop an aspirin, right? So the second industrial revolution will be chemical, and it will be led by Germany, and it's going to be revolutionary as well. Between 1900 and 1930, and that's getting us into the 20th century, but it takes some time to develop this, Germany wins 26 Nobel Prizes in chemistry. Biology. Again, moving into the mid-19th century, we're going to see some developments in biology that are going to be very important. Gregor Mendel, an Augustinian friar, again, this connection between church and science, I think is fascinating. He will start to experiment with peas in Austria. Some of you know very well Mendel's experiments with trying to figure out how peas work, yellow flowers, white flowers, crossing peas, right? He'll demonstrate the issue of heredity, right? That a certain pea strain parents produce certain traits in their offspring, right? And he will start to demonstrate the issue of heredity in what will become the field of genetics. He's not going to get there. He's not going to discover genes per se, but he's going to start to develop the process there. 1856. Also in 1856, we get another scientist, Rudolf Virchow, who gives us the theory that cells are the basis of life. Cellular biology. Here we go. Not long after that, Virchow says, and this is interesting as well in our discussion of the Enlightenment and social science, he says medicine is a social science. Medicine is a social science. Politics, for him, is nothing else but medicine on a large scale. He's famous for beginning public health initiatives. So this is a scientist who's taking his work into society. Politics is nothing but medicine on a large scale. Interesting. Interesting. Applying remedies. He says politics is applying remedies to social ills. Now, it might not be a national health care service, but clean water for a city, good street lighting for a city, a police force for a city, all of these things contribute to the health of the body politic. So we get Mendel, we get Virchow, and then Louis Pasteur in 1857. So extraordinary developments in biology, just coming hand over fist. Pasteur comes to understand fermentation. And I'm sure if you had some cereal this morning, the milk that you put on it was pasteurized. Getting rid of those microscopic organisms that might cause you difficulties in your milk. Finally, and we'll end with this, 1859, Charles Darwin publishes On the Origin of the Species. Talk about your controversies. Headed our way. So we'll wrap up this video with Charles Darwin, and in next week's discussion, we'll talk more about the role of religion. We'll talk more about Charles Darwin in the 19th century, and we'll be headed further, closer to the days in which we live now.